Okay, that's a really great question, isn't it? So the limitations of the gap fill task. I think Gabby made a really good point earlier about just the monotony of it. You know, they're really great, I think, for self-study, especially because in those typical self-study practice books, they often come with a key at the end. So the students can even check their own answers. And I tend to encourage my students to do that, you know, to go ahead and buy, for example, Raymond Murphy's, you know, Grammar Bible of Essential Grammar in Use. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that yourselves, either from having learned English or from, you know, teaching English now. It's great as a self-study reference. And then you might want to say to the students, if you got something wrong and you can't figure out why once you've seen the answer, bring your questions to class and then we can have a look at that together in more detail, because that's more useful for students, I think, than just going through like answer, question, and so I love that, Suzanne. Yes. Are you hugging it? Is it like a best friend to you? It's like, oh, Raymond, I love you. I love you. Absolutely. I have one within arm's reach myself, for sure. So, you know, gap fills are to be used. I'm not saying never use gap fills. I'm just saying that they're great for self-study, but maybe as teachers, we could be a little bit more inventive in the classroom and find ways of engaging the learners a bit more, which then helps retention because the tasks you're giving them are much more memorable. And a couple of you were commenting about, you know, using games or using crosswords. And I'd love to hear some of your experiences about the students' reactions to things that you do that are a little bit different. So playing games, for example, Mia, you were just talking about that, and with your, was it first year catering students, I think you mentioned? Would you be happy to say something about that to all of us? Mia, are you feeling brave?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Hello.
Hi. No, I wasn't the one with the catering students.
My
That was,
bad.
I think that was Maria. Sometimes Mia showed for Maria.
Ah, okay.
No, for me, it's just all different kinds of students. I always play games with them, like all sorts of games. But I could imagine doing that with catering students if I had any too.
And when you play games, is it with what age group are your classes?
Or all adults.
Mm,
So at the moment, mostly, no, actually not even young adults anymore. It used to be mostly young adults,
yeah.
but really anything from 16 to 70.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
And
they
isn't it,
all love playing games.
yeah, I know, it's incredible, isn't it? It's like, I think they get almost a bit embarrassed about how quickly they become so competitive. You know, it starts off about the language learning, and then sometimes it just becomes about the winning. We want our team to win. But again, I think that engagement, that motivation, that kind of like cross-class competition, that's what makes it really, really memorable. And then the learning of the language is kind of like an accidental byproduct from having fun. So I think it's fantastic to hear that so many of you are doing different things like that with your students. That's brilliant. Or I'm just seeing Gabby's comment there about some teachers saying that adults don't really enjoy games. Mia, that's certainly not your experience, is it? And
No, not
that's
at
not
all,
my
because you know that
experience.
there's so much that comes into it. It's not just the competitive element, because I do agree sometimes there are people who are maybe too competitive or not competitive. Also, they don't enjoy games in general, but they still enjoy it in class because they do realize that we are actually practicing something very specific.
Right.
So it's not just about the game. They're not
Yeah.
just throwing dice, but they're actually learning.
Absolutely. And I think for me, depending on who I'm working with, what kind of cohort, where they come from, what ages they are, sometimes instead of saying, right, okay, we're going to play a game, it's like, okay, now it's time for a vocabulary practice activity. So it's just the way that you sell it that can sometimes make the difference. You know, just even hearing the word game can make all of your serious business students go, games, games, I didn't pay you money for games. So if you can just sell it as a vocabulary practice revision activity, suddenly they're like super focused, totally on the ball, and you don't even realize that they're sneakily playing games. So that's quite a nice one as well. Just change the language that you use.
Yeah.
Exactly, and I believe that one of the reasons for certain adults not really being into games might be the fact when we just play games for the sake of playing games, let's
Right.
say, but when you have an aim,
Mm-hmm.
and then it makes a difference, a big difference.
That's so true, Hetty, isn't it? Because I mean, and again, I've been guilty of that. Oh, I've got like, 60 minutes to kill on a Friday afternoon. They're tired. I'm tired, and they're like, can we play a game, teacher? Can we play a game? And sort of like, 1 in every 10 Fridays, I'll give in and I'll go, yes, you can play a game just for the sheer fun of it. But I think as well, if you're very clear about the aim, and with adults as well, you can be super transparent and say, it may look like we're doing something silly, but actually the aim is this. You can tell your learners what you're doing, and then I think they're much more likely to buy into that concept of, like teamwork and rapport and gentle competition and fun. And I think everybody gets out of it, gets something out of it, because often it's oral as well. So even if they're not a massive fan of games, they find themselves being involved in conversations or wanting to correct, another student. So I think that's a great task. I can see Mia's got a hand raised there.
Yes, I just wanted to add one major benefit of playing games as opposed to doing gap fills on your own is also the collaborative element. You can correct each other, you can learn from others.
Definitely. And I think that's not to be underestimated. I think for a lot of newly qualified teachers, they have this kind of like, false belief that I am the fountain of all knowledge. I will stand on my teacher pedestal, or I will feed information down to you, my little small creatures. And I'm totally not believing in that. Within your class, and I'm sure you all know as practicing teachers, a level is a band. It's not a point. So let's say we've got like a pre-intermediate class, A2, you'll have some who've just come up from elementary and maybe a little bit weaker. And then you'll have some that have maybe been in pre-intermediate for 10 weeks, but they still can't get, past simple and past continuous right. Or they still keep forgetting that it's not goed, it's went. So they're not ready to move up to intermediate yet until they've got those firm foundations of grammar established. So I really think that peer teaching and peer learning can be a great way of like remotivating the more able students and also consolidating information in their head, because the best way to learn is by teaching. And if they're wanting to do that whole me level up teacher, me level up, they can prove their knowledge and ability by working with the ones who've just moved up from elementary, and thereby you can see how well the information has been consolidated by how well they express it to others. And I think for me, that's really important for your lower levels. So for example, I've taught in Arabic speaking countries. My Arabic is pretty much limited to like dejeuj et arroz, which is chicken and rice for those of you not in the know. And so I'm perfectly happy for, some of my stronger elementary students to explain something in Arabic to my less strong students, because as long as I can see that they're focused and they're on task, that's not a bad thing as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's a little bit unrealistic to expect your lower level learners to stay in the target language, so for example English, for the entire 90 minutes or the entire 2 hours, without lapsing back into mother tongue at least a couple of times. So peer teaching can be really great for that, because information can be exchanged on a level that maybe the teacher can't quite get down to.
And we can move on to the second question, Susie. If nobody else has anything to add to the first one, then let me pose the second one.
Oh, I love that. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Do students find gap fills useful? I think a lot of them do. And I think, yeah, Gabby's got it on the nose there. Gabby, did you want to chime in and say something? Go on, Gabby, I'd love to hear from you.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now, perfectly.
Yeah, look, you just got me, okay? Because I said yes and no, but now I have to really think of what I think. But yeah, I mean, of course, they find it useful because, there's no other way, right? I mean, this is how students practice grammar, okay? So it's very controlled, and it's useful. I mean, there is no denying that gap fill is useful. But, I actually think that students think that gap fill activities may be more useful than they actually are. Okay, so let me just clarify this. So what you said earlier about selling an activity to students, right? So if you don't sell a controlled practice activity to students properly, they will not buy it. So they will not see the usefulness of it, okay? Whereas a gap fill activity is a standard, classic, typical activity where students can see clear benefits, okay? Let me put it like that. So obviously, I don't think there is a single student who will deny the fact that a gap fill task is useful. I don't think you will find one, okay? Because it is controlled practice. The problem is that when students are in the classroom, it's what Mia said earlier, there is more to it, okay? So if you make this gap fill task communicative, if you change it, if you tweak it, and you actually make students use functional language as well, then what happens is they practice the target language, but they also practice communicative language.
Right.
So you see, okay, so this is how I mean. They find it useful because there is no denying that it is useful. And students can't really see past a gap fill task unless you sell it to them. I don't know if I'm making sense, but you really put me on the spot here.
No, you're totally making sense, Gabby. I think you're absolutely right, because I think in lots of different cultures, you know, gap fill is the way that students are taught. And, you know, certainly when they come over to the UK, or when I arrive in the country as their teacher, they were like, well, we're not learning proper English because we're not doing gap fill tasks. You know, because they're not able to see that, you know, a game actually has a serious aim. You know, they've been trained that the only way to learn grammar is by filling in the gaps. So I think you're absolutely right that students do believe it's useful, but I think that they may believe it's more useful than it realistically is. So no, I think you made yourself really clear.
Yeah, if I may just add one more thing. Sorry, I had it a second ago when you were speaking and now it's gone.
I'll just take that comment from Mia while you're having a bit of a think. I really love that, Mia, so that your Germans love structure. You know, the Swiss are a bit like that as well. They love structure. And also that the students from the Far Eastern countries, so Japan, Korea, China, when they're used to kind of writing things down, and that's why often their handwriting is beautiful, but their communicative English is maybe, you know, under the level that we might expect. That is changing because, you know, slowly the communicative method is gaining more popularity in more different countries and more different contexts. But I think some students find the gap fill a safe method of learning, and so there's nothing wrong with, you know, encouraging it for self-study, you know, bringing in a gap fill once a week, twice a week even, but yeah, I definitely think that selling the activity is important, and, you know, tweaking the activity so it's a little bit more communicative and interactive can make it more fun and more memorable.
And that was exactly the other point that I wanted to make. Okay, so you just did it for me.
I can read your mind, Gabby.
Yeah, you can't actually. Yes. So the thing is that you see, students who don't like games, who immediately dismiss games, because I've had students like that in my, you know, in my life teaching career. We all have these students. Kind of don't like games because they can never see the purpose of playing a game. So you see, this is the teacher's fault, because if aims are not kind of clear, it's this overt teaching idea. So if you are explicit about what it is exactly that students will be getting out of this task, out of the silliest game, students will not buy it. So it's about making it clear that it's not just a game.
And I think that's one of the key differences between teaching young learners and teaching adults, that your young learners, like, you know, don't care that it's grammar. In fact, you don't tell them it's grammar, it's a game, it's not grammar. Oh my God, no, it's not grammar, because they'll cry if they know they're doing grammar. But with your adult learners, then exactly as you say, you can be super transparent about, yes, you're throwing a dice, or, you know, yes, I'm asking you to, you know, come and stick a fly swat on the board or whatever it might be. But actually the reason is because I want you to practice X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Gabby. Like, you know, selling and activity aims are like super important to make things really clear. Great.
Exactly. And let me just post one more question.
Well, I'd love to hear from the people out there. I mean, I know that we've got some experienced teachers, working in their own countries, or maybe non-native speakers working in the UK. And often I think that those are the best ideas. Like, I'm so fortunate that English is the international language. If it'd been Mandarin or Arabic, then God help me, Lord. So I feel so grateful that English is the international language. But I always defer to the people who've had to learn English before teaching it, because you've got a sense of understanding the student's point of view in such a unique way that I don't have access to. So yeah, it would be great to find out what ways that you guys have adapted any gap fills in your teaching context. You've heard all of my ideas from the input session, so let's turn it over to you. Raise your hand. Yeah.
Well, if I may again, I mean, I don't want to hog the session. You know me, Susie. Once someone gets me started, I can't stop. But as a language learner, okay, I can tell you exactly what my experience was. I absolutely hated games. And it's just so funny, because now as a teacher, I do exactly the opposite, right? I loved gap fill activities. I hated games, but I really blame the teachers I had in the past, because I never could see any reason why I was kind of being made to play games. And with the gap fill task, I kind of felt that I was in charge. If I'm making myself clear, like, there was a task, there was a clear answer, okay? So it was not about the teacher, it was really about me. So I knew exactly what I was doing wrong. I knew what mistake I made. So it was kind of clear cut, okay? So easy for me to assess myself. So I felt I was in charge. With games, it was pointless, because there was no feedback on my language production, okay? So it was just playing games, fine, but what's the point of doing it?
Right.
So that's my experience as a learner.
I think that's really key, and that was one of the points that I made in the setting up the practice activity, that you need to do feedback. The game and the conversation and the communication and the collaboration is great, and that's all fun, but your learners are going to be making mistakes. And if it's possible that you can pop in, immediately correct and pop out, that's great, but maybe you can't. But your learners still deserve to have some feedback on whatever the language they're producing has been. So I really do think that's key for your adult learners to really believe in the benefits of the game or the activity, is if you prove that you were listening by then taking down some examples of things that you heard that went well, or things that you heard that could be done better. One of my other issues with gap fills is that it's a controlled practice task, so students understand that all of the answers need to be present perfect or second conditional. And then when they go into a freer practice activity where it's much more conversational based, then they're at a loss, because conversation doesn't fit into very neat, tightly controlled gaps. And so this is, I think, another important aspect about why we should think about making controlled practice activities more communicative, so they start the students along that conversational line, and thereby it's not too much of a massive shock to go from head down, this word goes in this gap, to, oh crap, now I'm going to have a conversation with anybody about anything, and I've got to try and remember that structure on the spot. So I really do think that feedback is super important in all language lessons, both during the clarification and during the controlled feedback, and if you can manage your time effectively after the freer practice, because you need to eradicate the errors in order for them to move on and get it right.
Exactly. I agree with that, and I can relate so much to Gabi's experience as well. I went through the exact same thing, but I also think that it is down to the education system, where you are trained to believe that playing is playing, games are games, and studying equals hard work, and these are two completely different things. So when you play, you cannot learn from playing games. And another thing that I experienced as a language learner a short while ago was that often when we had games, they did not relate at all to the target language that, let's say, we covered half an hour before that. So, you know, so that was another thing. And I also love this workshop and your input session, because you really emphasized the importance of variety, because when it's so important to change the frame of the task, so the content can remain the same, but the frame should be changed exactly for the reason what you said, that it's so predictable, and if you change the frame, you present the same task in a different way, students are lost.
Yeah,
completely.
absolutely.
And exactly, so it's very, very important. And so we had that question.
Just before you go to that, Hedy, just what I might, because just before we started live, everybody, Hedy was telling me her response to the personalization of the gap fill task that I included. So at the very, very least, if you don't want to go to the trouble of having to, you know, create a game from scratch, just changing people's names would be really, really helpful. And so nobody knew that I was doing that. So Hedy, when you saw your name on the gap fill task in the input session, how did that make you feel? Could you just say something about that?
Oh my God, I'm happy that nobody could see me, because I could not stay seated. You know, so it's just, oh my God, it was something I really did not expect that. It's just, oh my God, I can't even describe it. It just made the rest of the year for me. So,
that's thank you, Gabby, as well. I got the email that you sent me of like, oh, I really love this. And so that's proof to me, that's evidence that, you know, it's just a little bit of investment of time, and your students or the people around you just get so much benefit from feeling, you know, seen and included and acknowledged and you know, and embraced as part of the whole classroom team. So yeah, at the very least, just try doing that. That would be great.
Yeah, and you will definitely remember those sentences.
For sure.
So
yeah, especially if you're correcting them going, but I hate fish, Susie, I hate fish, you lied.
No, I got the love one, and she knows me. So that's great. And oh my God, there are so many messages coming in. And yeah, so we had that question, you know, can you share any ways that you have adapted a typical gap fill? And I don't know if anybody has anything to share with us. It would be so lovely to learn from each other. But I actually have some ideas to share. So regarding the gap fill, let's say if the focus is vocabulary, then what we can do is that, so you write a sentence, yes, and then there is a gap there. And so the word in question can be left out, obviously. And then variations to that is that, let's say I sometimes give the definition of the word right after the sentence in brackets, or I give the first letter of the missing word for the students, or with low-level students, I supply the missing word, but mess up the order of the letters. So I present it as jumbled words. Or I give, let's say, 3 options and they need to choose. So it's like multiple choice questions. But actually, I have one super cool that I love, and I'm always so excited about that, if I can share that with you. And that's a variation to how to use crosswords.
Okay, great. Yeah,
and
tell us that before we go to Maria.
Example.
Oh, super.
So I love this. So it's called actually half a crossword. And it means that, so this lesson was on nature and the environment. Actually, I use this to revise vocabulary, keywords. And so what happens in half a crossword is that the students work in pairs, and each gets their crossword, but as you can see, only half the words are there. The other half is with the other students. So they work in pairs, and the aim of the task is to find out the missing words by asking questions like, what's number 5 down? What's 13 across? And then, you know, my partner is going to give me a definition to find the word. It works really well with higher level students. So you define the word and give it a definition, describe the word, and then I need to figure it out. And if I can't, I'm not allowed to check vocabulary because my partner can help me. So they can give me the first letter. And then does it have? No. What's the second one? Okay. And now, you know, we can just practice spelling as well. And I really love this, and I think the students as well. And what I love is that communicative element as well. So it makes them think. And by the end of this task, even if they haven't had much time to do revision at home, they will remember much more.
Yeah.
So it's
Definitely.
And you can do this. So you can create or design your own crosswords. I just Google half a crossword, and then a link will pop up, and that allows me to design my own ones in less than 2 minutes.
Thanks,
You can print them, you can save them as a PDF document and use them again. But it's really, if you have 5 minutes before the lesson, and you can create that in 2 minutes as well. So
yeah, and Mia's offering Snakes and Ladders as well, which is like another classic, isn't it? That we all know how to play Snakes and Ladders from childhood, but you can also adapt your gap fills on that as well. I noticed there was a lady called Maria who had her hand raised earlier. Maria, did you have something that you wanted to tell us or share with us or ask?
Yes. Hi, hello. Fantastic afternoon again.
Thank you.
My question was, which I think I just wrote it down as well, is just that have you ever used adverts? And when I say adverts, like published in newspapers or magazines, to use them as a kind of like a warmer, a warm-up activity with very simple words and vocabulary from the adverts. You have ever used this? Well, anyone has ever used those?
Yeah, I think adverts are a really great way of introducing students to culture as well as language. And I think you're absolutely right, Maria. They fit really nicely at the start of a lesson to kind of engage interest really quickly and set the scene and get the students thinking about the kind of language that they might need to be using. So I guess depending on the level of the learners, you might use an advert as a warmer on a lesson about persuasive language, for example. But I think you might kind of struggle to find enough adverts to put them into a kind of like a controlled practice task. I don't know if you've already used something that you're able to share with us, maybe, but I don't know how I would use adverts as a language practice activity. So yeah, please give me some ideas.
Well, just okay. That was a long time ago. It's always a long time ago, but it did work very well. But of course, it's with advanced students,
right?
And I think perhaps there were more adverts, or people read more magazines in the old days, and you could just rip all the adverts off and manipulate them. And it was good fun. I often look for adverts, but now I have to find the adverts online.
That's the problem, isn't it? It tends to be like a lot of visual stuff, which is fantastic. But in terms of vocabulary or language, I think these days, the attention span of the average consumer is, like 0.5 seconds. And so if it's got too many words, people have already switched off. So that's why I think they're great to open a lesson. But yeah, maybe not so appropriate for the controlled practice. I also just want to, before we come to you, Gabby, just quickly go back to a comment made earlier about Kahoot. Now, I love Kahoot, but I don't think it's great for controlled practice because the students aren't actually producing any language. It's fun and there's lots of button pushing and speed rounds and all the rest of it. But I think you've got to be really careful as a teacher about how you can get the learners to produce the language from a Kahoot game, as opposed to just pressing a colored button. So, as a revision activity, I think it's great. As a warm-up activity, I think it's great. As a maybe like an initial controlled practice activity, just for recognition, I think it's great, but it's not going to perform the aim of production. So just be mindful when you're planning Kahoot that you're following it up with something that actually makes the learners either write or speak the word, and then it is a valid controlled practice activity, because often Kahoot isn't. Okay, Gabby, let's come to you.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so I have this one activity that I absolutely love, and I may even be overusing it. This is how much I love it. I like to call it walking sentences or walking grammar structures. So essentially, the main idea is that students mingle themselves into correct into the correct order of a sentence. So you know it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So say you have you have this really boring classic controlled practice activity with split sentences, right? Like match the sentences. So what happens is you just assign half a sentence to each student, and then you get them, you know, to stand up, and they have to mingle and find partners. But I also do it with a classic gap fill task. So there was this example on your slides where you had this one sentence for present continuous, I think, or for past continuous.
Past continuous, yeah.
So just imagine, okay, that you have 5 sentences and there is a gap that students have to somehow, students have to come up with the right grammar structure. So the right form of the verb or the right form of the noun or whatever. So just imagine that you have 5 sentences and you will probably need 10 students then. And what you do is you give 1 sentence to each student. So you have 5 walking sentences. And then you give the infinitive forms in brackets as presented in the traditional course book to the other 5 students, right? So what happens now is they all have to mingle and they find the infinitive walking or the walking infinitives have to find the sentence that they could fit into, and then they also have to change the verb into the right form. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's kind of difficult to set up first, okay? But you train your students, okay? You need to give clear instructions, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
But it just works. It's really challenging because students, first of all, have to work on the meaning, okay? Because they get the verb in infinitive. So they have to find the right sentence. So the right person who is the sentence, and then together they have to put this walking infinitive into the right form. So it's like, it's a double task.
And they get good awareness of what everybody else has as well. So it's not just limiting to the one particular thing. I think that's a really good idea. And this is one of my issues with online teaching. It takes away all those amazing kinesthetic tasks where at the end of a language lesson, you can get the learners up out of their seat, moving around, getting the blood flow active again, you know, changing the pairings. And even if you do it on Zoom, you know, by telling the students, this is the order that your windows appear in for me, you know, it still doesn't have the same fun, does it, as like physically walking around and peering over people's shoulders and like, you know, manhandling your classmates and going, I think you belong there, I think you belong there. So yeah, I really love that idea, Gabby, and I embrace the day when we can be back in a classroom and be doing like, you know, kinesthetic activities again.
Yeah, I have never heard of this, to be honest. I mean, not in this form. So I'm going to try, definitely.
Give it a go.
Yeah, exactly.
Fabulous.
So much fun. And yes, it's like at the beginning there may be a little bit of chaos in the classroom, but
chaos is great. I
Yeah.
think, you know, again, when you're teaching from a communicative perspective, we like noise, we like conversation, you know, we like to hear information being exchanged and opinions being given. You know, the idea that English exists in a vacuum just isn't true, is it? And again, that's one of the things that I just miss about not being in a physical room, that hum of background noise, you know, is lovely. And I love the fact that, especially in controlled practice activities, as a teacher, I can monitor my class by moving around the room and just getting an overview of how they're all doing. You know, in breakout rooms, it's slightly more challenging because I physically cannot be in the same place at the same time. Whereas in a classroom, even if I'm standing with one table, half of an ear is listening to that table, half of an ear is listening to that table. So I've got kind of like a wraparound view about what's going on in my room. And in breakout rooms, it's much more difficult to try and get an established idea of, you know, who really struggled and who found it successful, especially if you get caught up in a breakout room with a student's question. Of course you want to answer them, of course you want to help them, but then that comes at the expense of, you know, not being able to visit other breakout rooms. And if you were doing that live in a classroom, the student who asked the question, everybody else in the room would be able to listen to the answer. And so as a teacher, you've got to make a point point of making sure that you bring that back to the main room so that everybody is aware of the answer in case they were in different breakout rooms to begin with.
Exactly. And I see that we have a question for Corina. Corina, would you like to voice your question? You can unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Karina's saying she doesn't have her headset in.
Oh,
No
okay.
problem.
Yes. Okay, so then we can read.
Yep, I see it. So Karina's asking, what activities would you use the guided discovery approach with? So the guided discovery approach itself is a way of teaching whereby the clarification is done by the students together collaboratively. And then I would still come in with some kind of controlled practice task and some kind of freer practice task. So for me, the guided discovery approach is something that I definitely want to use, sometimes for both lower levels, but more appropriately for higher levels, when I think that there's enough knowledge in the room that they can figure things out themselves. You know, I will have adapted the activities. There's enough information on the task to help them. And of course, I'm monitoring and supporting and moving around as I go. But the main idea behind guided discovery is the students work it out for themselves. And then once they've worked it out for themselves, as a teacher, you can do any mop-up feedback or just check that everybody's got the right thing in the right places. And then you would still move to your traditional controlled practice stage, not the gap fill, but stage, and then moving on to the freer practice stage. Does that help, Karina, or did you want to add something else or ask something else? You can pop in the chat box if you're not able to speak to us. Good, happy to hear that.
That's great. I have a question, Susie, about timing. A little bit, just like, how long do you suggest teachers spend on controlled practice activities compared to the other stages, you know, language or systems lessons?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Hedy. And sadly, I'm going to go for my traditional, well, that depends. Because of course, are you working within a 45-minute time frame, or are you working within a 120-minute time frame? You know, what's the pace that the school is expecting you to move through the book? So this is why gap fills can be great, because you can give them for homework, safe in the knowledge that controlled practice is still going to be taking place. So if you're teaching in just 45-minute slots, I would aim for, you know, 8 to 10 minutes on the controlled practice activity. And depending on what that is, you know, there may be then some additional time needed to get budgeted in for the feedback. So it could be 8 to 10 minutes, you know, just for the students to complete the task. And then you'd also have to budget in maybe another 5 to 8 minutes on the actual feedback to the task. So it's really tight in a 45-minute lesson. And it's really, really common, certainly on the CELTA, that, you know, teachers don't quite make it to the freer practice task. That's fine. And the one piece of advice I would give you out there is don't rush a controlled practice task just because you want to get to the freer practice talking. It's way more beneficial for the learners to get decent error correction to a controlled practice task, and then maybe you can pick up the next lesson with some adaptation of the freer practice, which also then lends itself as being, you know, the warmer or the lead in, and then you can set up the next part of your lesson. But realistically, if you're only getting to the freer practice task with like 5 minutes left on the clock in a 45-minute lesson, you know, can fluency be developed in 5 minutes? It's going to take you a minute to give instructions. It's going to take the students a minute to sort themselves out or get themselves into breakout rooms or screen share or move chairs or whatever it is. Maybe they get to talk for like a minute and a half, and then that will be the most dominant, loudest student that the others won't have a chance to speak. And do you get any chance to do error correction or feedback? My argument is no. So scrap the 5 minutes on a freer practice task, and it's much, much better for the learners if you can just use the feedback to the controlled practice task to have a bit of a go at, like, you know, disappearing dialogues or a little bit of fun drilling or reclarification of concept checking questions, or, you know, getting the students to then at least personalize some sentences. Even if you can't quite fit in a full freer practice, you might be able to say, for example, okay, you know, so earlier on the control practice, we said that Hedy loves fish. What else do you love, Hedy? you know, and just a couple of little personalized questions just to kind of end the lesson in a freer, friendlier, chatty way. But definitely, Gabby, you know, follow up then with an adapted freer practice task, which then would lead in to the rest of the lesson the day after. That is the nice thing about working with learners day after day, that you know that if you don't quite have time for something in one lesson, that you don't feel the need to rush, that you can plan the next day accordingly, you know. And so things, for example, like a reading lesson, you might want to flip that sometimes and get them to do the reading at home so that they can take their time looking up words in dictionaries. And then when they come to class, you only focus on the answers, thereby saving yourself 10 minutes of actual physical reading. So there's corners you can cut, you know, if you want to keep language practice going. Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I think so too. So just definitely doing one thing well rather than trying to spread yourself too thin. And as I say, you know, can you really meet a fluency aim if the learners are only speaking for 90 seconds? My argument would be no. Thank you, Sylvia. I love it when people agree with me. It makes me so happy. How are we doing for time? Any more questions or comments?
Yes, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay,
and
great.
I actually, you've just mentioned your trainees. Have you ever observed a lesson where you could see that the students struggled with the control practice activity, and so what can be the reasons for that, and what can we do then? So
yeah, every week I see that for sure. And it could be for a range of reasons. It could be because the poor teacher has got themselves in a bit of a fix doing the language clarification. And maybe they haven't clarified language as well as they could have done. It may be that a switched on student has asked a question in the clarification that then takes the teacher a bit of time to answer, and it's only really relevant to that one student asking, and they're not quite assertive enough to go, great question, hold that thought, I'll come back to it at the end of the lesson. You know, I'm quite a bossy teacher, you might be able to tell. So I've got no kind of compunction about sort of like pressing pause on things if I don't think it's going to benefit everybody. You know, I'm perfectly happy to deal with comments and questions as we go through, but sometimes as the teacher, it's my job to drive the lesson, you know, and sort of swerve around any obstacles that are trying to take me out of my way, for sure. And I think for me, if the students are struggling with a controlled practice activity, often what I tell my trainees during guidance is be prepared for that by having controlled practice A and controlled practice B. So your controlled practice A will be something really simple and straightforward. And if your clarification goes really smoothly and tickety-boo, maybe we can scrap controlled practice A and just move them immediately onto the slightly more challenging controlled practice B. Whereas if they're just really not getting it at clarification stage, then scrap controlled practice B and only spend the time really working with them to build their confidence on controlled practice A. Again, thinking back to the input, remembering the aims of your controlled practice section. You want to build confidence, and you want to focus on accuracy, and you want to allow them an opportunity to use the language orally and written. Okay, so your controlled practice activity must do those things, and don't rush it if it doesn't, because how is that going to benefit the learners? If they don't have a firm foundation from which to springboard into freer practice, all they've got is like a foundation with gaps that they're just going to fall through by making mistakes and errors all of the time. Okay, so make sure there's a firm foundation in place for the controlled practice, and then you can move on to do the freer.
Exactly. So funny. Gabi has a question. I had the exact same question to ask.
It's this mind reading, girls. We're going to have to get this mind reading thing sorted out, aren't we?
What's happening? I think we are really tuned in. So Gabi is asking, what are the most common mistakes teachers make when running control practice activities?
Fantastic. And I think the biggest problem is underestimating time. I mean, again, even a 60-minute lesson, you know, it doesn't give you much scope to do a bit more, but 45 minutes is quite a tight time frame. But often that's the way things are scheduled in schools. You might get a 45-minute lesson, a 50-minute break, and then maybe another 45-minute lesson or a 60-minute lesson. So you need to learn as a teacher about budgeting appropriately when you're planning. You can't just be pulling numbers out of the sky. Okay, and this is why with my trainees, and I'm sure Joao, if you're watching, you'll attest to that I make them sit down and physically do the task themselves as if they were a learner. Okay, looking at it, that's great, but you've got no idea how it feels to have that experience. And if you're struggling to do the task, if you can't quite make sense of the instructions, or if maybe there's one or two questions, and I'm sure you've seen them, where actually two answers could be perfectly correct. If you haven't done that yourself and flagged that up as an anticipated problem to answer in the lesson, then you're just going to run into all kinds of trouble. So don't tell yourself that, you know, an elementary group completing, you know, 6 questions is going to take 2 minutes. Like, really do the maths. Like 6 questions, 2 minutes, that's like 30 seconds per question. I'm pretty sure I couldn't do it in 30 seconds, you know. So you've got to be realistic, and you've got to allow an appropriate time frame for the learners to really get to grips with manipulating this new language, because that's what controlled practice tasks are all about. Manipulating new language, building my confidence, and making sure that I'm accurate. If you're rushing me, guess what? Those things are not going to happen. Okay, so I would say sit down, do it yourself, check the answers, because there may be more than one correct answer, and then not just think about the time it takes for the learner to do the task if they're doing it individually, but what about pair check? Are you going to give them time to collaborate with their peers and partners? Are you going to give them time to go, oh, I couldn't do number 3. What did you get? Can you help me? Oh, we've written something different for number 5. We need to talk through this together. That's not a 60-second activity at all. That's where some really juicy peer learning and peer teaching can take place, and where error correction can be fed in by the carefully monitoring teacher. So I'd be budgeting, as I said, about 8 to 10 minutes just for the task itself, and then an additional 5 to 8 minutes to do feedback. Okay, so don't underestimate the amount of time a controlled practice task will take. Thank you, Sylvia. I love being right. One of my favorite things.
It makes life so much easier.
Oh, doesn't it? And when people just agree with you that you're right, and then there's no arguments, again, that's just like, life is so easy, you know. Joao, are you there? I can't see if you're still currently logged on or not, but if you are, raise your hand. I'd love to hear from you how the CELTA and how the session today has helped you with your continuing teaching practice. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you really well. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Really lovely to see you after all this time.
Same to hear you rather than see you. So how's it going? How did you find the session? And do you think you'll be able to use any ideas in your teaching career now?
Well, I'm loving the session. It's really nice to go over all these concepts and all the things that I've learned through the CELTA course. It's almost been 2 years.
No way!
Unfortunately, yes. And I'm afraid I haven't started my teaching career yet, although I am currently applying for different kinds of jobs worldwide. But
yeah, COVID has taken its toll, hasn't it?
Yes,
so I totally understand
absolutely.
that. Yeah,
so
it's challenging times.
That certainly halted all my plans, but well, nevertheless, there's always hope.
Absolutely, there's always hope, and it's brilliant that you're keeping yourself up to date, and you're continuing your CPD post CELTA with joining in the gallery workshops. So it's fantastic to have you on board. Yeah, really well done, because so many people just kind of after the CELTA, if they're not straight in a classroom, let things tail off. And as you say, Joao, so nicely, it's great to just kind of like revisit and reinforce and revise all of those things that were covered. But I'm sure a lot of people have the same experience. The CELTA is like so intense that actually the real learning comes post CELTA, when you've got time to absorb information and be open to asking questions. Whereas on the CELTA, it's just like, just do the next assignment, just do the next plan, just do the next language analysis. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed for you that a job will turn up. And if anything does turn up, then I'll put it on my Susie CELTA Facebook page.
Thank you very much.
Amazing. Right. And just to finish off, Susie, so any final, I don't know, suggestions to us, or words of wisdom, secret to making control practice activities like more engaging, interactive, and student-centered?
Sure. Yeah, I would don't say never use gap fills. You know, students half expect them and they do have their uses, but at the very least try and personalize your students' names to make it motivating. Okay. Really take the time to prep your controlled practice because that time is invested, not wasted. I think that was a great comment from earlier on, that it's not a waste of time, it's an investment of time. And when your learners respond to an activity that you've created or adapted, it's motivating for them, but it's also really rewarding for you and makes you want to continue to adapt things for them. So this kind of like cycle of, you know, joy and happiness and motivation and encouragement is then kind of like, you know, ongoing in a lovely infinity loop. All right. So do take a little bit of time to do some prep, and keep logged into the gallery forum. There's loads of other amazing workshops by other fantastic teachers and trainers that you can listen out for. And it's also a community of teachers that you can share ideas and activities exactly as you've been doing so successfully this afternoon. So thank you all so much for joining us. I've had a great time and I really hope it's been useful for you too.